All right, next thing I want to talk about is creating something called a composition. And a composition in After Effects or in video editing is where the video goes. Okay. So in when we were in Adobe Photoshop or Photopea, you had to set up like your document, right? And you would set up things like the dimensions, width and height, right? And at least in something like Photoshop, you would have to set up something called resolution, which is how many pixels there are per inch or per unit of measurement. These were the settings of your project. And in the same way, that's what a composition is here. We are bringing in video and images, and we are creating a composition that eventually we are going to export as a video format, as a QuickTime or an AVI or whatever it is that we're creating. And that project needs to have properties or settings. Okay. So let's go through how we would do that. Now, to create a new composition in your project, you can go to composition and go to new composition or Command N. Okay. And you're going to get something that looks like this. So let's go through the different settings. The first thing is your composition needs a name. It's pretty common. Eventually, we're not going to do this right now, but eventually we will have multiple compositions in a project. So it's good to name them so you know the difference between them. I'm just going to call this my first composition. Okay, you can call it whatever you want. You can use spaces. Pretty sure you can use special characters, but don't quote me on that. The next thing is the dimensions. Okay. Now, technically, you can set up the dimensions of an After Effects file to whatever you want. So, for instance, I could set this to be 500 pixels by 500 pixels. Okay. Just note that we are going to be using pixels because at the end of the day, pixels are a unit of measurement, as I mentioned when we're talking about Adobe Photoshop and Photopea and all that. A pixel is a unit of measurement for screens, like a computer screen, like you're looking at me right now, or a cell phone screen or something like that. And since, when we make video, it's always going to be displayed on a computer screen or a television screen, and all of those use pixels. We're just going to use pixels as our measurement. Unlike, say, Photoshop, where you might print something to physical analog paper, that's not going to happen in this program. So we don't usually measure things in things like inches or, metric or anything like that. Now, technically, you can set this up to whatever measurement you want. I can make this 500 by 500, 1,000 by 2,000, whatever I want. That being said, there actually are standardized measurements for video. This is what we use in television and in film and stuff like that. So rather than just kind of making up our own, it's usually a good idea to kind of use some of the existing common dimensions. Okay. So what I'm going to do, let's go to so you might have heard the term standard definition or SD, sometimes it's referred to. This is an older format. It's less common to see, although you may see it on YouTube. And that format is 640 by 480, also sometimes 720 by 480. Okay. In this class, I'm going to probably use standard, not because that is the standard. I would say actually HD is probably the standard these days. But the way it works is that when you have a smaller dimensions, the video will be a smaller file size. And I don't want you guys dealing with very large file sizes. So I may use standard, you know, when I do like examples and practice and things like that. That being said, if you want to go into, do high def and stuff for YouTube or, for actual television or whatever, you're probably not going to use this. But in that everything I teach you will apply to this. It's just when you start getting into these bigger size formats, it's going to be bigger files to deal with, and that just slows it down, especially if your computer's a little bit slower in terms of a graphics card or a processor. Having it be a smaller file size might be a little better. Um, The next up is high def HD. Okay. When people talk about high definition, there are technically two different things that count as HD. One would be 1280 by 720, and the other one would be 1920 by 1200. Okay. So, you might have on your television screen, if you have a HD TV, which most people usually do at this point, you might notice that your TV is measured in as 9 they probably don't say pixels, but they probably say 1920 by 1080 or 1080. Whoops, not 12. Uh, Sorry about that. It's 1920 by 1080, not 1200. They probably say something like, 1920 by 1080. They mean 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. Okay. So either of those technically counts as I guess yeah. So I guess they call this full HD is more the term. Technically both would count. These days, you may have run across the term 4K or 8K. So, when people talk about 4K, what is 4K? 4K means 4,000. So, what they're really saying is it's a much larger format in terms of like the size of the composition. So, a composition for 4K, I've never really done much for 4K, so I'm not as familiar with the sizes, but my research says it's about 3,840 by 2160. And then if you have 8K, guess what that means? It means 8,000 and then so on and so on. So my advice is figure out what you need. In this class, like I said, I'm going to be working small. And the reason is not because standard is that common, but more that you know, it's just going to be an easier file to deal with. Yes, having things at 4K would be great, but that also means that the file is going to be a lot bigger and it's going to put a lot more it's gonna impact your graphics card a lot more and stuff like that. So I'm trying to keep things easy. But, in the future, maybe you're working with someone and they want it to be 4K, you would set up your composition here to be 4K. So if I wanted it standard, that'd be 720 by 480. If I wanted it HD, that'd be 1920 by 1080. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Can I delete that? Or if I wanted it 4K, that would be 840 by 3840 by 2160, I believe. Yeah. Okay. You can also use the preset here. Um, Presets, like it sounds like, is a preset. So you can see how under HD it already has 10, 1920 by 1080. It has Ultra HD, which is 4K. Um, 3840 by 2160. Some of these already have the presets here. This is for film. So film is 2Ks the size. So, you can kind of choose these out. That's the first part here is the dimensions. Next aspect is what's called pixel aspect ratio. And what that really means, I mentioned this before, is the idea of whether your pixel on your computer is an exact 1 for 1 or whether it's 1 versus zero point 0.9. The answer, so this question is, I drew this wrong. This makes it look like it's wider. It should actually be thinner here. It should look more like I don't know, like that, where it's zero point 0.9 here. But anyway, the question is, do you want a perfect square or do you want this kind of off square? which would be considered zero point 0.9. The answer to that is really what you're doing. If you're setting this up for the internet, so what I mean by that is if you're let's say what is your final output for your video? If it's something like YouTube, then you would definitely want it to be a square pixel. The same for like social media if you're posting it to X or TikTok or something like that. I would definitely use that format. Most of the time, I really would say use square pixels. The only time I would really say not to is if you were trying to export to legacy media, like standard definition. Some television stations do use zero point 0.9, not all of them. So that's kind of one of those, like, if that comes up, you might ask them to use square pixels or to use zero point 0.9. So some older formats like DVD. So if you were to set your video and author it for DVD, that might be zero point 0.9. Those are pretty specific cases though. So I would really say for now, really just, square pixels is the way to go. You can always, change it later if you need to for those particular cases I was talking about. Next is something called frame rate. Okay. Frame rate is literally if you come from like if you've ever done animation before, like you've taken animation class or made your own animation, frame rate is how many frames of a video or animation there are per second. Okay. So let me explain what that means. So don't worry about what I'm doing, but like what's happening here is this is a video, right? You can tell that because I can scroll through it. So it's not a static image like something you would make in Photoshop or something like that. Now, if for every, here's one static image, and then there's another static image, and then another, and then another, and then another, and then another. Okay. And there's a bunch of static images that makes up this. We call this an image sequence. So I literally can like, oops, is it, thought it was the dollar sign, maybe not. I can literally kind of go through frame by frame. Now, the question is, how many frames are there per second? So, like, if I were to play this, there's the video playing. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, I had a stopwatch on my phone. And after 1 second, I counted how many frames there were being played back. That is the frame rate. Okay. So, for instance, currently, this is set to about 30 frames a second. So what that means is for every 1 second, there are 30 pictures. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way down. And the way to think about this is there's all these pictures, right? And the way I like to think of it is kind of a bit like a flip book. I'm assuming you guys have made flip books at some point in your life. Mhm. So when you have a flip book, your finger literally flips like the photos, right? So this guy made a Pizza Hut, whatever. Pretty cool. Those little flip books. These are all individual drawings that he did, right? And he's playing them back. His finger, is literally playing them back. But you could flip the photos faster or shorter. So in other words, like if I were to play this at twice the speed, this plays back faster than it did originally. And at the same token, I could also make it slower. So he's flipping them slower, right? So in other words, the speed at which he's flipping them means how many pictures there are per second. Okay. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, when you set up a composition, in addition to the dimensions, you're also setting what the frame rate is. Okay. How many frames are there per second? Okay. Now, in the same way, there is no wrong dimensions, although there are common dimensions used in film and television. There's no such thing as a wrong frame rate. You can technically make your frame rate whatever you want it to be, but there are common frame rates, okay, that are used in the television industry and films and stuff like that. So it helps to kind of understand what those are. So in America, we use something called the NTSC system. NTSC, National Television something something. Great class, right? I don't even remember what the acronym is for. No one ever says the whole name of it, but it's NTSC System Committee. Okay, that's it. Committee. They're the people who come up with the standards for television in the US, and not just the US, but any place that uses NTSC, which we'll talk about. NTSC versus PAL. So any country here that uses that's in green, which would include Canada, Mexico, parts of South America, Japan, they use the same system that we use. And in their system, there are 25, or sorry, 30, about 30 frames a second. It may be 29.97. It may be 30. Why is there that 0.03 difference? The difference is that um, before everything was digital, meaning using computers, you had to have the literal tape. So I know I'm dating myself here, but before there was everything was digital, vi TV shows and movies were recorded or saved onto tape, acetate tape. Uh, like literal tape. Okay. And, it took the tape would run through the machine, and it takes time for the tape to run through the machine because it's a physical analog thing. And so to get the 30, they actually had to give it about 0.03 seconds for the tape to move. And that's where the difference is. These days, you could just do 30 because we do everything digitally and computers can move a lot faster than an old school machine could. And so 30 or, usually they're pretty much interchangeable. So if you were doing something for US television or film, I would probably say it's a good idea to set your frame rate to about 29.97, 30. If you're setting up something for Europe or parts of Asia, they use a different system called the PAL system. So this is NTSC, which is the phase alternating laser, also known as PAL. And so you can see that Australia, most of Europe, parts of Africa and Asia, essentially any place that was ever colonized by Europe probably uses the PAL system. Uh, Not always, but that's generally the good rule of thumb there. And then there's something called CCAM, which is something that the French invented, and basically only France and Russia uses it. I forget the exact frame rate, but anyway, going back to, so if you're doing something for PAL, they use a system of about 25 frames per second as opposed to 30. And if you're doing actual film, meaning it is recorded onto actual acetate film, which, to be perfectly honest, in these days is becoming more and more rare. Even a lot of when you go to the movie theater and watch like a Marvel movie, that's still digital. So it being recorded to actual film is becoming much more rare. So I don't know whether this would be. is as useful, but let's just hypothetically say you were doing that, that would be about 24 frames per second. It's important to set it up to the right um, frame rate because let's just say for the sake of argument, you set your frame rate to 25, but then you played it back on US television, which uses 30, what would actually happen is it would speed up the film a little bit, and vice versa. Maybe you made something in, NTSC at 30 and you played it back in Europe, it would actually slow it down a little bit. And that's not always what we want. We don't want our speed to be changed at all. So it's a good idea to sort of set the frame rate to, what you would want it to actually be. Okay. So if I go back, you'll notice here that you can actually, the frame, if you do the preset, you can actually set the frame rate. I'm actually just going to set it to an exact 30 frames per second. Okay. Resolution means that when you view the composition in After Effects in the program, not when you export, how is the quality full quality? So the reason I would recommend full, the reason why I wouldn't, you might want to turn this down is if your computer was kind of slower, like you didn't have a very good graphics card or having it at full resolution might slow your computer down, but having it at half resolution or third resolution might make it run a little bit faster. Um, so you could do that just for playback speed. Um, Note that resolution does not affect when you actually export your video. So viewing it at, say, half resolution in After Effects does not actually affect it when it gets exported out of After Effects. Okay. It's a little confusing at the moment, but just trust me on that. This is purely just for playback within the program. Okay. Next is something called time code. We're going to go under duration. Duration means how long is your composition? Okay, like literally how many like seconds and minutes and hours and that sort of thing. So we have to understand something called time code. Time code is if you've never done video editing before, or maybe you've never noticed this on YouTube or whatever. There's a way that people who do animation and films and TV and such, we mark time. Okay, the beginning of something and the end of something, and it usually looks something like this. So the way that this works is these are frames. Frames are a fraction of a second. How many frames there are is completely dependent on whatever you set your frame rate to your composition to. So in other words, if you set your composition frame rate to 30 frames per second, this would go up to 29. And then when it goes over to the next one, this is seconds. This is minutes. And this is hours. Okay. So what that means is if I were to write, say, this would mean if this was my duration, this means my composition is 10 seconds long. If I put it like here, this would mean my composition is 1 minute long. This, if I put it here, this would mean my composition is 1 hour long. Okay. You can always go back and change this later. So don't worry that you're being locked into it, but just note that, you may, if I recommend probably setting your compositions to like at least a minute or 30 seconds. So under duration, I've set this to about 30 seconds. Um, Start time code means do you want to start at exactly 0, 0, 0, 0, 0? Why would you not want to do that? The answer is if you were connecting multiple compositions to each other, which is something I don't want to talk about right now, you could have, like, for instance, this could start at 0, 0, 0, last 30 seconds, and then the next one I do could start at 30 seconds, and then, when you copied and pasted them, they'd all sort of match up, if that makes sense. Don't worry about that for now. I don't Even maybe later on when we talk about working with multiple compositions, we will get into that, but that's a little too much too soon. Finally is the background color, which is literally what the color of the background of the composition would be. It usually defaults to black, but if you click on it, you can change it to a different color if you'd like to. There's my composition. Okay. There's and if I were to look at this, you can see how it shows me, based off the columns we talked about when we did the project layout, how many frames per second there are, what my out point is, or the duration essentially of my composition. Let's push this is the size. So I can tell this is an HD and that it's using square pixels. That's what the one represents, the aspect ratio of the pixel. If you ever want to go and edit, you can always go to composition settings. So for instance, let's just say for the sake of argument, I wanted this to be smaller. So I'm going to set this to 720 by 480. And let's change the background color to red, hit OK, and then hit OK. And now my composition has been updated. You can see it got updated here. Another way to make a new composition is there's this little option, this little button here that kind of looks like a piece of film with some squares and circles and such on it. I'm going to click on that, and you can see that automatically gets to the creates a new project. Or if you click on one, if it's being highlighted, you can click on that and it'll automatically bring up the settings for this one so I can make changes to my settings. Alrighty, right. I think that's it for compositions. All right. So play around with that, be able to set up compositions. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how to lay out content once it's been brought in, and then eventually we will get into animating. Okay.